Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
African American history is an intricate tapestry of white cruelty and beautiful culture. A key event in this history is the Little Rock Nine crisis of 1957, where 9 African Americans rose tensions after integrating at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This event embraced triumph as it advanced the civil rights movement and racial equality, but it also flirted with tragedy, as Black students weren't truly equal, weren't treated the best either, as well as the fact that segregation has yet to completely disappear. African Americans were once enslaved in America until eventually being freed in 1865. Despite not being property anymore, there were still racial tensions, and Jim Crow laws ensnared them, especially in the Deep South. But the 20th century came as a progressive time. Women emerged from the chains of the cult of domesticity, and the gay liberation movement flourished in the later part. But one of the pivotal aspects of this was the civil rights movement. And all this progress occurred, but none of it, not a single ounce, seemed to come without a fight. Progress for African Americans completely began with the Brown vs. Board of Education rule in 1954. It said that segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. It replaced the previous Plessy v. Ferguson ruling. But later, in 1957, 9 students were selected to integrate at Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. These 2 events seemed to show as if everything might turn out all right. Integration of Central High came closer and closer, and suddenly, on the birth of September, Governor Orville Faubus ordered the National Guard to the school to prevent the racial integration. Daisy Bates, a member of the NAACP, didn't take this lightly, and asked to go to school in a group with all the 9 Black students. These young Black teens were met by a brick wall of hate the next day, but Elizabeth Eckford had to bear it all alone. Eckford didn't hear of Bates' idea, so she walked by herself. All students were denied entrance by the guardsmen. Eisenhower, after encouragement from Martin Luther King Jr., gave in to the pleas for troops to protect students that came from the parents of the Black students, and sent down the Army's 101st Airborne Division and federalized the Arkansas National Guard. The 101st Airborne Division left midway through the year, but the Arkansas National Guard stayed. The 9 Black students eventually returned to school on the 23rd. The Little Rock Nine, as the media dubbed them, made it through the school year. But solely because of this achievement did not mean that this success, this achievement, was void of any tragedy. Each and every of the 9 students endured harassment that no teen psyche should be met with.
As I'm walking in the homeroom, somebody threw a purse, and I picked it up, opened it, and it had 6 locks, combination locks in it. And I just dropped it to the floor and said, "Leave me alone, white trash." Well, guess what? The teacher heard me, and I went down to the girls' vice principal, and she sent me home, and they said I was going to be expelled, and we appealed it and did all kinds of things.
But the tragedy just didn't lay in the treatment of the Black students, but the ignorance of the white teens, the environment that they had to grow up in that cultivated these ideas. Some of them even went and hung a straw effigy as if it was a Black student in protest of this integration. The triumph aspect of this was somewhat unseen until later, but there was one immediate success. as Ernest Green became the first African American to graduate from Central High. King was even in attendance of his graduation. But before the eventual triumph came, more tragedy rained down in the form of what was referred to as the lost year. Faubus could not handle that black students were now attending the previously all-white Central, so he closed any of the schools required to desegregate by federal law. Somewhat ironically, this led to white students now sharing the burdens of their parents' racism, but it was a much lighter potence that the blacks were hit with during this. Both black and white scrambled for sources of education, but blacks were having a much harder time finding education sources. Only 50% of them found some, compared to the 93% of whites that did. But fortunately, schools opened again for the 59 through 60 school year. The Little Rock integration crisis proved to be a victory as it helped to give life to the civil rights movement of the 60s. The media exposure, as well as the fact that this was a civil rights event in itself, is what helped to cause the advancement of the civil rights movement. According to Carlotta Walls Lanier, in an interview I conducted, a member of the Little Rock Nine she was, it was because of the media exposure that was new to the public that probably helped President Eisenhower send in the 101st Airborne. We were the second biggest news in 1957. It was a highly televised event, and the TV provided sorrowful video that allowed some to sympathize.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up?
If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school.
And blacks to finally stand up against the Anglo-Saxon superiority complex. The Little Rock Nine proved as a monumental step towards desegregation of our schools. But unfortunately, the racism, it was not slowly choked by the media, it was just put on a tighter noose. And this noose was sadly loosened in 1988 with the flow of desegregation efforts that began in 1970 was halted. As of today, there is still segregation, as from 1988 and onward, the number of schools with 10% or fewer whites went from 5.7% to 18.6%.
According to Department of Education statistics, in 1988, the number of black students in majority white schools peaked to over 43%, and then dropped down to 23% in 2011.
Although it should be noted as a success that white students encounter much more diversity in their schools compared to what it was in 1988. Lastly, it is a natural wonder exactly how this affected the segregationist white students at Central at the time. How did it affect their current beliefs, and do they have any regrets?
David Sontag came here today, he says, to apologize to Minnie Jean for an altercation in the cafeteria. What happened?
Oh, I just went in the cafeteria and I'd sort of been dared by other kids, to retaliate for Minnie Jean for having poured chili on someone's head earlier, and so I did it. But it was not done out of hate.
What was it done out of?
It was just done out of ignorance.
Mm-hmm. But it's not without a doubt that the Little Rock crisis has had a remarkable effect on the white students. For example, Hazel Bryan took her 5 years, but it filled her with rue. She had been a young girl screaming at Elizabeth Eckford on her way to school. She called her. She said, "I don't know what triggered it, but one day I started squalling about how she must have felt. I felt so bad that I had done this that I called her and apologized to her." The events at Little Rock stand today as something that greatly shaped who we are, but also something that came with great suffering and was slightly less powerful with the eventual reversals of desegregation efforts.